The crack of crutches hitting pavement silenced the HOA picnic. Karen smirked over my fallen wife, the same woman she'd mocked as a pity-seeking fraud. What this clipboard tyrant didn't realize, those 50 stunned witnesses weren't just neighbors. They were jurors in waiting. And the helpless cripple she'd just assaulted, the district judge overseeing their $2.7 million embezzlement case. By sunset, those smartphone videos would be Exhibit A, and Karen's empire would crumble. Blood seeped through Hannah's shredded palms as she locked eyes with Karen, not pleading, calculating. The collective gasp from our neighbors hung in the air as they stood frozen like statues at the HOA picnic. Karen, the self-appointed HOA president and queen of unfiltered entitlement, just smirked and muttered something about fakers draining the community. The worst part? She thought she'd won. She thought she was putting a disabled woman in her place. What she didn't know was that the woman now slowly pushing herself back upright with shaking arms wasn't just some random resident. She was the newly appointed district judge for the same county preparing a multi-million-dollar fraud investigation against the HOA. And Karen had just committed assault in front of 50 witnesses and 3 smartphone cameras. It had only been 3 days since we moved into this neighborhood, hoping for some peace and a slower pace after Hannah's spinal surgery. We bought a modest single-story house near the pond with a shaded porch and enough yard to grow tomatoes. What we didn't expect was to land smack in the middle of a gated community ruled by an HOA president with the subtlety of a wrecking ball and the grace of a cat fight. Karen had introduced herself on day one by slapping a compliance violation sticker on our mailbox because the numbers weren't in approved HOA script. The next morning, she knocked on our door to remind Hannah that pity parties weren't the reason to drag crutches across decorative walkways. We'd smiled politely and brushed it off, thinking maybe she was just having a rough week. We were so wrong. Hannah hadn't even wanted to attend the community potluck. But I convinced her we should try to meet people to show that we weren't there to stir anything up. We brought homemade cornbread. I pushed her in a transport chair, which she used for longer distances, and when she wanted to stretch her legs, she used her crutches. She had just stood to walk toward the dessert table when Karen strutted over, scanned her from head to toe like she was inspecting a car for scratches, then snapped, "Disabled? Please. You're just lazy rich trash who can't even fake a limp convincingly." That moment, that heartless strike to her crutches. She did it with a camera-ready shrug and a snide comment about how we should apply for the neighborhood theater club instead of pretending to need sympathy. For a few seconds, everything paused. The wind, the voices, even the spoon someone had dropped into the chili. Then the crowd broke into either stunned silence or murmured concern. I was already kneeling next to Hannah, checking her hands and asking if she was okay. Her eyes met mine, not with pain, but with something else entirely. Not rage, not shock, but strategy. She was already calculating the legal implications. Karen waved her hand in the air and loudly declared she had just been testing a theory about how quickly people can stand when they're not actually disabled. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered Karen's full name and added a curse word. Then a man stepped forward with his phone held high. He had captured the whole thing from multiple angles. Karen's face twitched for the first time. She tried to demand he delete it, but the guy told her to sit down and maybe try Googling battery assault laws before flapping her mouth again. We left the picnic shortly after. Trey, a kind older man who lived 2 houses down, wheeled Hannah back to our porch and offered us his assistance anytime we needed it. Turns out he was a retired civil attorney with a long memory and a longer list of grievances against Karen and the HOA board. He explained how Karen had taken over the HOA 3 years ago through a technicality when the former president got transferred for work. Since then, rules were rewritten, budgets mysteriously drained, and fines issued at random. Hannah listened quietly. She asked a few pointed questions about the HOA's budget allocations and how community vote records were handled. Trey blinked at her tone and asked what she did for a living. Hannah just smiled and said she'd recently been assigned to a courtroom in the district. She didn't mention she'd be presiding over a pending lawsuit involving Karen's HOA. Back inside our home that evening, I made us tea while Hannah took notes. Her laptop open, documents pulled up, law citations dropping into a spreadsheet. I knew that look. It was the same look she had the day she put away an embezzling city treasurer using a single line of deposition testimony. She wasn't mad. That night, I found Hannah cross-referencing case law with one bandaged hand. Know what they never teach judges? She murmured. How satisfying it feels to personally dismantle a bully. We didn't go to war. Not yet. We simply watched. Observed. Karen must have thought she'd successfully marked her territory. The next morning, we found a friendly reminder taped to our door about not leaving wheelchairs unattended on the front porch. Hannah didn't even blink. The following day, the HOA newsletter featured a tone-deaf article about contributing able bodies to community beautification efforts. Hannah underlined the phrases and added them to her file. I started calling it the Karen dossier. On the third day, we received a violation notice in the mailbox saying our property had an illegal ramp structure. That ramp was approved by the county and constructed with medical-grade materials. It was also built in accordance with the ADA guidelines Hannah herself had once helped revise during a city ordinance case. She laughed when she read it. Not a full laugh, but that quiet kind of laugh someone gives when they know their opponent just stepped on their own landmine. By Friday, Karen called for an emergency HOA meeting to discuss rising disruptive influence from recently moved-in residents. The flyers went out. Half the neighborhood rolled their eyes. The other half packed lawn chairs. Hannah didn't attend. She didn't need to. Trey recorded the whole thing and sent it to her. Karen stood at the gazebo ranting about fake injuries and legal parasites draining the soul from the neighborhood. She even claimed that she personally had the right to interpret ADA access because she used to date a guy in code enforcement. The crowd didn't cheer. They whispered, murmured. Some even stood and left halfway through. Back at our house, I sat with Hannah on the porch. The sun was setting and the cicadas buzzed softly. She rested her hand on mine and said without looking at me, "Do you think she'll be surprised when she finds out who I am?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The truth was coming fast and heavy with court filing's official stamp. For 72 hours, Karen's kingdom held its breath. Then the county auditor's subpoena arrived, and the real storm began. People kept their distance a bit more when walking by our place, though not in a fearful way, more like cautious curiosity. It was as if they knew something had shifted, but didn't know which direction it would go. Hannah didn't say much, but I could tell she was already 5 steps ahead of whatever Karen thought she was planning. Her injury wasn't worsening, thankfully, though her palms were still bandaged and sore. But more than physical pain, I could see the rising focus in her eyes. That quiet, measured fire only she had when the law was about to become personal. On Monday morning, we received our second code violation notice, this time for non-compliant flower bed edging. The kicker? We hadn't planted anything yet. The previous owners had left a border of stones around a patch of dirt, and apparently that was now a danger to community aesthetic. Attached to the warning was a $300 fine and a suggestion that we seek landscaping guidance from approved HOA partners. You think $300 fines terrify me? Hannah rasped, lifting her phone. Try explaining why Silver Fern Group's landscaping fees paid for your Porsche. She placed the paper into a manila folder labeled HOA Interactions and opened her laptop. I watched as she began drafting an internal report for the State Judicial Review Board. It wasn't about personal revenge. She was documenting misconduct one line at a time. As judge, she couldn't afford to act emotionally, and she never did. Her calmness was unnerving in the best way. It reminded me of those nature documentaries where a lioness lies quietly under a tree, eyes half closed, waiting for the exact moment her prey steps too close. Later that day, Trey came by with a flash drive. He looked tired but determined. Apparently, another resident, an elderly woman named Yvette, had her mailbox uprooted by HOA contractors who claimed her mailbox was 2 inches too close to the sidewalk. Yvette, who used a cane and lived alone, had begged them not to remove it. She'd offered to adjust it herself, but they ignored her and ripped it out anyway. When she complained to Karen, the response was a formal warning stating that failure to comply with neighborhood modernization could lead to a lien being placed on her home. Hannah thanked Trey, loaded the flash drive into her laptop, and began watching the footage. It was rough, grainy, and shaky, but you could clearly see the workers ignoring Yvette's protests. One even laughed. That's when I saw Hannah's expression change just slightly. Her mouth tightened and she leaned forward. She replayed the clip 3 times. Then she turned to Trey and asked one question. Had this kind of behavior been happening often? He nodded and said yes. For over a year now. The only reason it hadn't gone public was fear. Karen retaliated fast and viciously, often through fines, threats of foreclosure, or public humiliation at HOA meetings. The door had officially opened. This wasn't just about a kicked pair of crutches anymore. It was a pattern of intimidation, financial coercion, and civil rights violations. Hannah began building a timeline. She added Yvette's incident to it, then followed up by reaching out to the county records office. Within hours, she had documents showing a series of code enforcement complaints issued from HOA addresses, not from the city. That was a big red flag. An HOA can't impersonate municipal authorities. That's impersonation and legal overreach. She sent the first of several quiet inquiries to the district attorney's office, not as a judge, but as a concerned citizen with documented evidence. Meanwhile, Karen didn't stop. If anything, she escalated. That Tuesday, while I was washing our car in the driveway, she marched down the street with a measuring tape and clipboard. She walked straight onto our property without knocking and began measuring our porch step. When I asked what she was doing, she muttered about possible non-standard dimensions and future enforcement. I told her to leave. She smirked and said that as HOA president, she had the right to inspect all structures within the community. I replied that trespassing laws still existed outside her fantasy land of laminated rules, and if she didn't leave, I'd call the sheriff. She rolled her eyes, took one last photo, and strutted away like she just won a game only she understood. Hannah stood at the window, watching the entire scene unfold. She didn't say anything immediately. Instead, she opened another browser tab and began reviewing state-level protections for private property within HOA zones. Then she pulled up our property deed and zoning record. Within the hour, she discovered something neither of us expected. Our home and the lot it sat on had been added to the HOA boundary under a legally questionable annexation a year ago. The previous owners had never signed the agreement. That meant, depending on interpretation, our property might not legally fall under HOA jurisdiction at all. She looked up at me, eyes lit with a dangerous calm. If this held up in court, not only was Karen unlawfully enforcing rules against us, she was doing it to dozens of homes that were annexed the same way. That's a class action level violation. We weren't the only ones possibly exempt from the HOA's grip. All those residents who'd been fined, threatened, or harassed may never have been subject to HOA rules in the first place. That evening, Hannah met with Yvette and Trey on our porch. She walked with her crutches, but didn't use them the whole way. Her confidence had returned in full force. She laid out what she'd found, and both of them sat stunned for a moment. Trey eventually smiled, shook his head, and said, "Well, I'll be damned." Yvette looked near tears. She said she'd been afraid to fight back for so long, she forgot what it felt like to have someone on her side. By Tuesday, 17 mailboxes bore Trey's handmade signs. Karen's rules end here. By Friday, the pond fountain ran dyed red, someone's idea of symbolic justice. The next morning, Karen showed up again, this time with two HOA board members and a laminated binder of neighborhood violations. She handed us an official notice to remove our ramp and repaint our porch or face escalating fines and forced corrections at our expense. Hannah took the papers, read them carefully, then calmly handed them back and said we'd be responding through official legal channels. Karen frowned. Legal channels, she repeated. Hannah gave her a polite smile and said, yes, as per your HOA Charter's Clause 37 and your state compliance statute, Section 9. Karen blinked like she'd been hit with a dictionary and walked off, muttering something about calling a lawyer. She was going to need one. Hannah's quiet, surgical approach wasn't just about proving a point. It was exposing an entire system of abuse and corruption that Karen thought she could keep hidden behind fake fines and community gossip. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly understand yet, was that the judge she tried to humiliate was now the very force preparing to dismantle her empire from the inside out. The countdown had officially begun. Wednesday morning began with a letter slid under our door, a thick envelope sealed with an HOA stamp, and a flare of unnecessary drama. I picked it up thinking it was just another violation notice. But when I opened it, I found something new. It was a formal summons to a disciplinary hearing issued by Karen herself, accusing us of repeated noncompliance, community disruption, and defamation of the HOA. It read like a soap opera script written by someone who had just learned what a thesaurus was. Hannah read it silently from the dining table, one eyebrow raised. When she finished, she simply said, she's spiraling faster than I expected. She wasn't amused. She was gathering evidence. Karen scheduled the hearing for Friday evening at the community clubhouse. The letter said attendance was mandatory and failure to appear would result in automatic punitive measures, including liens and legal action. Hannah printed the notice and placed it gently in the growing case file. She didn't need to debate whether to attend. She had already begun drafting a formal letter for the Judicial Ethics Board, alerting them of a possible conflict of interest due to her upcoming involvement in the HOA fraud investigation. She would remain impartial, but as a private citizen, someone being directly harassed, she had every right to defend herself. And this time, she would do it in front of a crowd. That night, Trey brought over a stack of HOA financial statements he'd gotten from a friend who used to sit on the board before Karen took over. The numbers didn't make sense. A $75,000 landscaping project charged to a company called Silver Fern Group. A quick online search showed the company had no digital footprint beyond a mailbox address and a disconnected phone number. Another $40,000 allocated to legal consulting fees. No associated case numbers, no firm listed. Just line items draining the HOA budget every month. Hannah's fingers danced across the keyboard, pulling property tax records, cross-referencing vendors, scanning county databases. Then she found it. Silver Fern Group was registered to a man named Carson Maddock. 3 clicks later, she discovered Carson Maddock was Karen's cousin. It was a textbook embezzlement scheme: inflate invoices through shell companies, funnel money through ghost accounts, and disguise it all as necessary neighborhood spending. The difference this time was that the person discovering it wasn't just a concerned citizen. She was a sitting district judge with direct access to the state attorney general's office. She emailed copies of her findings to 2 separate departments under different aliases for legal preservation. She wasn't just preparing to defend herself at Karen's ridiculous hearing. She was preparing to deliver a truth bomb that would shake the foundation of the entire HOA. Thursday passed with growing tension. Karen went on her usual patrol, but this time she was visibly agitated. She paced rather than strutted, and her clipboard trembled slightly in her hands. She stopped at random houses, spoke to confused neighbors, and distributed freshly printed flyers accusing us of being neighborhood agitators. The flyer included a photo of Hannah from the potluck edited to appear menacing, along with a list of vague accusations like inciting community disorder and abuse of influence. I couldn't believe it. It was like she was running a political smear campaign in a gated suburb. Some neighbors took the flyer and threw it in the trash immediately. Others tucked it away quietly, perhaps out of fear. But we noticed a shift. Some residents began walking by our house a little more slowly, giving a small nod or quiet thumbs up. Not everyone was fooled anymore. When Friday arrived, we got ready calmly. Hannah wore a plain blouse, neat slacks, and a silver bracelet I gave her years ago during her first judicial appointment. She didn't dress to intimidate. She dressed to remind Karen and everyone else of exactly who she was. We walked together to the clubhouse. The path was lit with solar lights and lined with silence. Neighbors peeked through blinds. A few followed behind at a distance. By the time we arrived, the clubhouse was packed. More than 50 residents sitting on folding chairs, some fanning themselves with HOA newsletters, others staring at Karen as she adjusted her microphone at the front. Karen began the meeting with a forced smile and scripted speech about order, respect, and community standards. She mentioned our names more than once, always followed by phrases like non-compliant behavior or legal bullying. When she finally invited us to speak, the room turned quiet enough to hear the hum of the air conditioning unit. Hannah stepped forward with a calm smile and thanked Karen for the opportunity to address the board. Then she pulled out the HOA charter, flipped to Clause 17, and read aloud the rules regarding due process in community disciplinary hearings. Karen blinked. Hannah continued, pointing out that the charter required at least 10 days' notice for such hearings and a review by a neutral third party. She asked Karen who the neutral party was. Karen stammered something about the board. Hannah then distributed copies of a 10-page document to every attendee. It detailed the financial irregularities found in the HOA statements, included visual breakdowns of the silver fern transactions, and cited specific laws violated by the misappropriation of community funds. There were audible gasps. One man in the back whispered, "She has receipts." Karen's face drained of color. Hannah's voice remained steady as she explained that as a private resident, she had submitted this documentation to the state and was formally requesting an independent audit of the HOA's finances. Karen attempted to interrupt, claiming that these were slanderous accusations from someone who was trying to stir trouble, but Hannah didn't flinch. She simply stated that her role as a judge gave her no special legal privileges in this matter, but her expertise gave her the tools to bring transparency where corruption had festered. She ended her statement with one simple line: "When systems of power forget who they serve, they eventually fall. Tonight, you get to choose which side of that fall you're standing on." The room stayed silent for a full 10 seconds. Then someone stood up and clapped. Then another. Within moments, the entire room erupted in applause. Karen looked like she had been slapped across the face with her own rulebook. She tried to regain control, banging her gavel and yelling that the meeting was adjourned, but no one moved. Instead, residents began to approach Hannah, asking questions, sharing their own stories, handing her photos and documents they'd kept hidden for months. One woman handed her a USB drive, saying she had recordings of Karen threatening to increase fines unless people attended her charity fundraisers. We left the clubhouse, not in silence, but surrounded by quiet voices sharing names, dates, and evidence. A community, once afraid, had started to open its eyes. Karen had intended the meeting to be our public shaming. Instead, it had become her unmasking. And though the war was far from over, it was clear now that she no longer held the ground she thought she ruled. The next chapter wouldn't be fought in HOA meetings or over printed flyers. It would be in a courtroom on record, under oath. And for the first time, Karen looked like she knew it. The weekend after the hearing was anything but quiet. News of what had unfolded at the community clubhouse spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Word of mouth was faster than any HOA newsletter Karen could craft. And this time, the message wasn't coming from her. It was coming from the people who had sat in that room and watched her facade crack wide open. For the first time since moving in, People who once avoided eye contact now stopped by our gate, offering timid greetings, whispered thank yous, and sometimes even paper trails of their own grievances. Hannah kept everything organized, every complaint cataloged with names, dates, and attachments. She wasn't just building a case anymore. She was exposing a system that had thrived on silence. On Monday morning, Hannah received an email from the state auditor's office confirming receipt of her submission and requesting a formal interview. That alone was a signal of how seriously they were taking it. A few hours later, a second message came in. This one from the district attorney's Special Investigations Unit. They had opened a preliminary inquiry into possible financial misconduct within Karen's HOA board. Hannah's eyes scanned the screen while sipping her coffee. Her face didn't change. She simply nodded once and said, "It's beginning." Karen had poked the wrong bear, and now the legal machine was warming up with cold, relentless efficiency. Karen, of course, had no clue just how fast her empire was unraveling. She made one last desperate attempt to regain control by sending out a dramatic HO-wide bulletin titled, "Restoring Community Harmony." It was 4 pages long and filled with vague accusations about sabotage, outsider influence, and how the HOA must remain vigilant against internal threats. She never mentioned Hannah by name, but the subtext was clear. She called for a neighborhood watch expansion, volunteer enforcers, and even suggested residents start documenting interactions with uncooperative members. It was the closest thing to a call for a private militia that a suburban HOA could manage. And just like every desperate move she made before, it only backfired. That same day, Trey came over with breaking news. One of the former board members, Karen, had forced out months ago, had contacted a local investigative journalist. The man shared financial documents, audio recordings, and testimony outlining how Karen had rewritten policies to funnel contracts to family friends. That journalist was already preparing a story for a regional news outlet. It was scheduled to air the following Sunday. Hannah thanked Trey, but she had already predicted this turn. Her plan wasn't just legal, it was public, exposure from all sides, the courtroom, and the court of public opinion. Later that evening, something strange happened. A black SUV with government plates rolled slowly through the neighborhood. It stopped briefly in front of the HOA office, a converted garage attached to Karen's house. 2 men in suits stepped out and took photographs of the building before speaking briefly with someone inside. No one knew exactly which agency they were from, but by the time they drove off, the gossip had exploded. Even Karen couldn't spin this one fast enough. Her fortress of laminated rules and clipboard patrols was now surrounded by whispers, doubt, and cold fear. By Thursday, it was official. Hannah received notification that her courtroom assignment had been finalized. Due to a recent shift in judicial scheduling, she was confirmed as the presiding judge in a civil lawsuit that had been filed by several residents against the HOA. It was a separate case from the one she had filed complaints about personally, but this one involved overlapping fraud claims. The ethics board had reviewed the situation thoroughly and determined she could proceed, provided she recused herself from specific claims involving her own property. Hannah was ready. She'd already prepared for that. This wasn't about her. It was justice. The day of the first hearing arrived with clear skies and unusual calm. Hannah wore her robe for the first time in weeks, her posture poised, an expression unreadable. I sat in the gallery surrounded by neighbors, many of whom had come not as spectators, but witnesses. Karen entered last. She looked nothing like the woman who once stormed down sidewalks with a clipboard and a glare. She was pale, lips tight, and clearly shaken. Her lawyer followed close behind, a man who looked more like a tax accountant than someone prepared to fight a public firestorm. As she took her seat at the defense table, she glanced around the room and saw faces of the very people she had spent years intimidating. None of them looked away. Some didn't even blink. Hannah opened the proceedings with practiced calm, stating the case name and its purpose. She laid out the court's expectation of civility and fairness. When Karen's lawyer tried to object, citing bias due to Hannah's prior involvement, Hannah calmly produced the ethics clearance form already notarized and filed. The room was silent as the judge's gavel came down to proceed. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Mrs. Ivette testified about her mailbox being ripped out. A single mother spoke about being fined over $2,000 for having a child's toy left on the porch. A retired veteran, cane in hand, described being publicly shamed at a meeting for requesting ADA-compliant sidewalks. Then came Trey, presenting files and photos, timelines, documents, all proving that the HOA board under Karen's command had operated more like a private cartel than a community organization. But the most damning moment came when Hannah called an expert witness, an independent forensic accountant who had analyzed the HOA's financials. He presented clear evidence of irregularities, missing funds, and payments made to ghost companies, including Silver Fern Group. When he detailed the connection between Karen and the fictitious vendor, she finally cracked. She stood and screamed that this was all a setup, a witch hunt, a betrayal. The courtroom buzzed. A bailiff stepped forward. Hannah didn't raise her voice. She simply instructed the clerk to strike the outburst from the record and calmly resumed the proceedings. By the end of the day, Karen's lawyer requested a recess. The judge granted it, but everyone knew what was coming next. Evidence was overwhelming. Her own board members were testifying against her. Her neighbors had turned on her. The agencies watching from the sidelines were ready to pounce. And Hannah had done it all by following the law without once raising her voice, without stepping outside the bounds of justice. As we walked out of the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter. Neighbors approached us, not just with relief, but newfound confidence. One man offered to paint over the hateful signs Karen had hung. Another said he was organizing a vote to remove the remaining HOA board members and start over. And then someone suggested a new name for the community, Liberty Grove. Hannah smiled but said nothing. She didn't need the credit. She never did. Karen thought she was punishing a weak woman for being different. What she didn't know was that she had assaulted a sitting judge, harassed a legal mind sharper than any courtroom lawyer she'd ever faced, and triggered an avalanche that would bury everything she built on lies. And now all that remained was the final judgment. 2 weeks after the courtroom hearing, the final judgment was delivered. The courtroom was packed again, this time with even more residents, local reporters, and community members from nearby HOAs who had heard about the case through word of mouth and regional news coverage. The journalist Trey had mentioned had gone public with her expose the day before the ruling, and the story had already made waves online. Karen's face was plastered across social media with headlines like HOA president accused of fraud and abuse and gavel comes down on suburban tyrant. She entered the courthouse with sunglasses on and a scarf pulled around her face, a far cry from the proud, domineering figure who once paraded through the streets, issuing fines and threats like a monarch in a cul-de-sac kingdom. The ruling was as thorough as it was devastating. The court declared that Karen had indeed violated numerous statutes, including financial misconduct, abuse of power, discriminatory enforcement of HOA codes, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Her assets were to be frozen pending an independent audit. The judge, Hannah, having presided over the evidentiary hearings but not issuing the final ruling due to her own conflict of interest, stood in the back of the courtroom in civilian clothes while a peer from another district read the judgment. Karen was ordered to pay restitution to multiple families, face a federal audit of the HOA's finances, and was permanently barred from holding any HOA-related leadership position in the state. Furthermore, she would be subject to a civil rights complaint under ADA statutes, which could lead to federal charges. Her attorney looked like he aged 10 years in 2 weeks. Karen didn't speak. She didn't even cry. She just sat there staring at the floor as everything collapsed. Outside, Reporters swarmed for comment, but Hannah simply thanked the community for their courage and transparency. She reminded them that justice is not loud but consistent, and that systems only improve when people refuse to be intimidated by those who believe power excuses cruelty. People clapped, some even hugged. It was one of those moments that didn't need banners or confetti. The relief on people's faces was its own kind of celebration. Back in the neighborhood, change began quickly. An emergency election was held for a new HOA board. And this time it was done properly, with third-party oversight and fair voting procedures. Trey was nominated and unanimously voted in as president. One of the first motions passed was to audit all HOA funds going back 5 years. The budget was finally made public. Fines were suspended pending review, and residents were given the opportunity to appeal past violations without fear of retaliation. It felt like oxygen had returned to a place that had been suffocating for years. Karen's house, once the nerve center of neighborhood anxiety, became oddly quiet. A for sale sign appeared in the yard within days. Rumors swirled that she had been forced to liquidate her property to cover mounting legal costs. She was occasionally spotted walking her dog with her head down, ignoring the same neighbors she used to bark orders at. No one harassed her, but no one offered her a smile either. She was now a ghost in a place she once ruled, haunted not by others, but the echo of her own actions. One Saturday morning, as we sat on our porch with coffee, Hannah spotted a group of kids riding their bikes past our home. They waved and laughed, completely carefree. It struck me how something so simple, children playing without fear that a toy left on the sidewalk would lead to a fine, had become a symbol of the change she helped bring. The ramp Karen once called an eyesore now had flower pots along its edge, donated by a neighbor who said he wanted to help beautify it properly, the right way, with kindness. Later that week, a community event was held in the newly renamed Liberty Grove Commons, formerly Karen Ridge Green. There was music, food, games, and a speech by the new board thanking everyone for standing up for what was right. When they called Hannah to the small makeshift stage, she hesitated at first, but eventually rose to her feet. She said very little, just that she was proud to be part of a community that remembered how to stand up without stepping down on others. The crowd applauded, not just out of politeness, but out of genuine gratitude. Karen did not attend the event. In fact, she hadn't been seen in days. A moving truck pulled up one morning and slowly emptied her home. She left without saying goodbye, without acknowledgement, and without the control she once clung to like a weapon. She had become the cautionary tale whispered in the margins of HOA newsletters and community circles, a warning of what happens when power is abused under the guise of neighborhood management. Weeks turned to months. Peace settled over the community like the slow blooming of spring. Fewer complaints were filed. Fences were repaired with offers of help instead of citations, and neighbors began exchanging more smiles than suspicious glances. The fear had been replaced by fairness. The silence had turned into shared laughter. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One morning, I watched Hannah as she watered the herbs in our garden, her movements steady and peaceful. She had walked away from the courthouse that day with more than just legal success. She had reclaimed something personal, a quiet dignity that no longer needed defending. She glanced at me and smiled. I smiled back, knowing the weight she had carried and the strength it took to carry it with grace. As the gavel fell, Karen finally learned what real power looks like, and it wasn't her laminated rulebook. It was the woman adjusting her robe, crutches leaning against the bench like sheathed swords. Karen had kicked the crutches of a woman she believed to be fragile. But in doing so, she had kicked open the door to her own unraveling. She thought she was silencing a nuisance. Instead, she awakened a judge. And that judge didn't seek revenge. She sought justice. And in the end, that justice reached further than even Karen could have imagined. What began as a single cruel act at a potluck picnic became the catalyst for a complete transformation. A neighborhood that once feared the clipboard of an HOA president now thrived under the leadership of empathy, lawfulness, and transparency. And somewhere far away, maybe Karen still tells herself she was the victim. But the rest of us knew the truth. The woman she tried to humiliate was never just another resident. She was the very force that made sure no one else would suffer under unchecked power again. And she did it not with vengeance, but purpose. Quiet, relentless, unshakable.